I pressed my palm against the frost-covered window and watched my breath cloud the glass. Nessa placed her hand beside mine. Our fingers matched perfectly, thin, red from the cold, and marked by the same crescent scar on each left thumb. We got those scars 3 years ago when I tried splitting firewood without knowing how to swing an axe. The blade glanced off a knot and bit into my thumb. Nessa grabbed the axe from me before I could try again and swung it herself. The same knot, the same angle, the same thumb. We wrapped each other's hands with strips torn from our underskirts and never told our parents. The scars healed identical. Between us on the narrow cot, Biscuit exhaled through his nose and shifted his weight. The border collie had belonged to our father, but after the fever took both our parents, the dog attached himself to us with a desperate loyalty that felt like the only thing holding the three of us together. His black and white coat was matted from too many weeks without proper grooming, but his body gave off heat that neither Nessa nor I could generate on our own anymore. We were 17 and 16 years old, orphaned for 3 months. Our whole life fit into one wooden trunk shoved against the wall of the storage room behind Brennan's general store. The room smelled like burlap and lamp oil, and the particular kind of cold that settles into places where no one is supposed to live. Every morning I woke with my shoulders drawn up to my ears, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Every night Nessa cried so quietly I wasn't supposed to hear. The trunk held everything we owned now. 2 dresses each, undergarments mended so many times the fabric looked like spider webs, a hairbrush missing half its bristles, the quilt our mother had pieced together from our baby clothes, and wrapped in oilcloth at the very bottom, $40 in bills and coins. 3 months of wages. Every penny we had earned scrubbing floors, mending shirts, hauling water, and chopping vegetables until our hands cracked and bled. Outside the window, Cedar Falls, Nebraska, lay buried under January snow. 1888 had arrived without fanfare, without hope, without mercy. I turned 17 on the 3rd day of the new year. No one remembered. Nessa would be 17 in December, if we lived that long. The fever came in October, when the leaves were turning. Our mother, Catherine, fell ill first. She tried to hide it, kept working, kept cooking, kept pretending the flush in her cheeks was from the stove and not the sickness burning through her blood. By the time she collapsed, the disease had already found our father Thomas. They took them both to the makeshift infirmary the church set up in the fellowship hall. Rows of cots, the smell of carbolic acid trying and failing to mask the stench of sickness and death. Our mother's hand felt like parchment when I held it. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper that I had to lean close to hear. "Take care of each other." 4 words, the last thing she ever said to me. 8 hours later, our father died. He went quietly, his big blacksmith hands limp on the thin blanket, his chest simply ceasing to rise. Our mother followed him before dawn. They died the same way they had lived for 23 years, together, 6 hours apart, as if neither could bear to be in this world without the other for very long. The funeral was on a Thursday. 14 other graves were dug that same afternoon. The whole county was hemorrhaging people to the fever. We stood at the graveside in our best dresses, holding each other upright while the pastor spoke words that meant nothing. Biscuit sat between us, his ears flat against his head, whining low in his throat. When the first shovel of dirt hit the pine coffins, Nessa's knees buckled. I caught her. We stayed standing. After the funeral, we learned about the debt. A man named Dalton from the county office came to the house we'd grown up in. He wore a black suit that smelled like mothballs and carried a leather satchel that clicked when he opened it. He laid papers across our kitchen table and explained in a voice that sounded almost apologetic that our parents had borrowed $340 2 years ago. They'd tried to open a shoe repair shop. It failed. They'd been paying the loan back in small increments, but with both of them gone, The full amount came due immediately. The house would be sold to cover the debt. We had until spring to vacate. I didn't know what vacate meant until he explained it. Leave. Get out. Disappear. Nessa asked if we could keep anything. Dalton looked at his papers and said we could take our personal belongings. Everything else belonged to the bank now. The furniture our father built. The dishes our mother brought from her own mother's house. The tools in the smithy. All of it, stamped with a debt we never knew existed. We packed the trunk that same day. I folded clothes with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Nessa wrapped our mother's journal, a ledger book where Catherine had recorded recipes and household remedies and scattered thoughts about her years homesteading in Dakota Territory before she married our father. I found 3 letters our father had written, addressed to my daughters, but never sent. The ink was faded, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded many times. I couldn't read them. Not yet. I put them at the bottom of the trunk, beneath everything else. Mr. Brennan offered us the storage room. He was a widower who ran the general store with the efficiency of a man who'd spent 40 years learning to do everything alone. He didn't smile much, but he wasn't cruel. The arrangement was simple. We could sleep in the storage room if we worked for him, sweeping, stacking, hauling, sorting, whatever he needed. No wages, just shelter. It wasn't enough. We needed money for food, for lamp oil, for the future that stretched ahead of us like a frozen road with no end in sight. I found work sewing for Mrs. Peterson, the tailor's wife. She paid me 15 cents for every shirt I finished. My stitches were small and even because our mother had taught me well, but my hands were slow because the cold made them stiff. On a good week, I could finish 6 shirts, 90 cents. Nessa washed linens at the Riverside Hotel. The work was brutal. Her hands stayed raw and red from the lye soap and the constant wet. She earned 25 cents a day when there was work. Some days there wasn't. Some days the hotel keeper looked at her and said he didn't need anyone, and we both knew it was because we were orphans now, untethered from the respectability that came from having parents who could vouch for us. Between us, we made about $2.50 a week. Bread cost 10 cents a loaf. Beans were 8 cents a pound. Cheese, when we could afford it, was 12 cents for a small wedge that we cut into pieces so thin you could see through them. We burned through 50 cents a week just staying alive. The rest we saved. 70 cents. $1. 85 cents. We wrapped the money in an old handkerchief and hid it at the bottom of the trunk beneath our parents' things. Every week the pile grew a little bigger. Every week we counted it and calculated how long before we'd have enough for a room at the boarding house Mrs. Whitmore ran. $4 a week for 2 people. We'd need $16 just to make it through 1 month. At our current rate, that was 5 months of perfect work with no sickness, no accidents, no weeks where the hotel didn't need laundry or Mrs. Peterson didn't have shirts to mend. 5 months of sleeping in the storage room and eating bread and beans and watching our money pile grow with the aching slowness of water freezing. But Mrs. Whitmore had other plans. She came to the store one afternoon in late December. Beatrice Whitmore was 50 years old, a widow who wore her mourning blacks like armor and ran the only boarding house in Cedar Falls with an iron hand and a sharp eye for profit. She had a face like a hatchet and a voice that could cut through noise or silence with equal efficiency. She found us in the storage room during our brief rest between the morning shift and the afternoon work. Nessa was mending a tear in her skirt. I was trying to coax Biscuit to eat a piece of bread he didn't want. Girls. Mrs. Whitmore didn't knock. She simply appeared in the doorway, blocking the light. "I have a proposition for you." I stood. Nessa set down her needle. Mrs. Whitmore stepped into the room and looked around with the expression of someone examining a stable. "This is no way to live. You need proper lodging, proper supervision. You're young girls without family. People talk. I kept my voice level. We're managing. Are you? Her eyes swept over us. You look half-starved.
You smell like you haven't had a proper bath in weeks. Nessa's coughing every night. I can hear it from across the street. It was true. Nessa had developed a cough in November that wouldn't go away. The cold in the storage room made it worse. Some nights she coughed so hard she couldn't catch her breath. I have a solution. Mrs. Whitmore folded her hands at her waist. Nessa can come stay with me. I need help with the boarding house. Cooking, cleaning, serving meals. She'll work for room and board. No wages, but she'll be warm and fed. She smoothed her skirt. As for you, Willa, Mrs. Peterson has mentioned she could use live-in help. You'd stay with her family. Same arrangement, work for shelter and meals. The room felt smaller. Biscuit's ears went flat. We'd be separated. My voice came out steady, even though my throat was closing. You'd be cared for. Mrs. Whitmore's tone suggested this was obvious. Separated by 2 blocks. You could see each other on Sundays, after church. No. The word came out harder than I intended. Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows lifted. No? Thank you for the offer, but we'll stay together. Her expression shifted into something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if I'd responded exactly the way she'd expected. Pride comes before a fall, Miss Thorne. You'd do well to remember that. She left. The room felt larger, but colder. Nessa was staring at her hands. We can't stay here forever. Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I know. What happens when spring comes and we still don't have enough money? I don't know. It was the truth. I didn't know. I lay awake every night, running calculations that never added up. We were drowning in slow motion, and everyone in Cedar Falls was watching it happen with the detached interest of people observing something inevitable. Then Mr. Brennan called us to the counter one afternoon in late January. His face looked heavier than usual. Snow was falling outside, small, dry flakes that rasped against the windows. Old Ezra Pike froze on the road last night. I knew the name. Everyone did. Ezra Pike was a trapper who lived alone in a structure about 5 miles northeast of town. No one had seen him in weeks. In winter, that wasn't unusual. Trappers were solitary by nature and necessity. He was 67 years old. Mr. Brennan's voice was flat. Had a place out past Cedar Ridge. County's putting the land up for back taxes tomorrow. $40. The number hung in the air between us. $40. The exact amount we had saved. 3 months and 3 weeks of work. Every penny we owned wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of our trunk. What kind of place? My voice sounded strange in my own ears. Mr. Brennan hesitated. It ain't much. He cleared his throat. It's what they call a Quonset hut. Curved metal roof over a wooden frame. Ezra built it from salvage. No well, no road, just the structure, and about 10 acres of marginal land. Marginal. I knew that word from the county maps. Land nobody wanted. Too far from town, too exposed, too difficult. But it's standing. Mr. Brennan met my eyes. And it's $40. That night, the wind rattled the boards of the storage room like bones trying to break free. Messa and I lay on the cot with Biscuit wedged between us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Outside, the temperature was dropping. Inside, our breath made clouds in the lamplight. What are you thinking? Nessa's voice was muffled against Biscuit's fur. I'm thinking about land. She shifted, turned her head to look at me. The lamplight caught the edge of her face, made her look older than 16. We don't know anything about living out there. Mama did. Before she married Papa, she homesteaded in Dakota for 10 years.
She knew how to survive. She had a house. She had help. She had herself. And she wrote everything down. I was thinking about the journal. Our mother's careful handwriting. Pages and pages of instructions and observations and hard-won knowledge about living in places where survival wasn't guaranteed. I'd read it 3 times since she died. Every time I found something new. If we stay here, I chose my words carefully, Mrs. Whitmore will keep pushing. Eventually we'll run out of options. We'll have to accept her offer, or something like it. And if we go? Nessa's question hung between us. I didn't have an easy answer. If we went, we might die. Cold, starvation, sickness, accident. All the ways the prairie killed people who weren't prepared, or weren't lucky, or simply weren't strong enough. But we'd be together. Nessa was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across Biscuit and found my hand. Her fingers were cold. She laced them through mine and squeezed once. Together. I squeezed back. We walked to the county office the next morning through snow that came up to our ankles. The sky was pale and empty. My feet were numb inside my boots by the time we arrived. The clerk was a thin man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He showed us a map. A lonely square of land marked in faded ink with the word marginal written in small letters beneath the property lines. Are you sure about this? He looked from me to Nessa and back again. You're just girls. That land is 5 miles from town. No neighbors except old Joseph Weaver, and he barely counts as human company. I'm sure. He pushed the papers across the desk. I signed with our father's name because at 17 I couldn't legally own property. The clerk didn't question it. He took our $40 and counted it twice. Then he stamped the deed with red ink and slid it back across the desk. Outside, the wind cut through our coats like we weren't wearing anything at all. Nessa tucked the deed inside her dress, against her skin where it wouldn't get wet or lost. We walked back to the store in silence. The sky was getting darker. More snow coming. Mrs. Whitmore was standing outside the boarding house when we passed. She watched us with her arms folded across her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes followed us all the way down the street. I'll save a spot for you girls, her voice carried across the frozen air. When you come crawling back. Nessa's hand found mine, squeezed hard. I didn't look back, didn't acknowledge her. We kept walking. That night we sorted through the trunk one more time, packed only what we absolutely needed. 2 dresses each, the quilt, the journals and letters, a spare pair of stockings, a small sewing kit, the items our father had left behind, a whetstone, a good knife, a length of rope. Everything else stayed. We couldn't carry it. Biscuit watched us with his head tilted, his brown eyes tracking every movement. He knew something was changing. Dogs always knew. Mr. Brennan let us borrow his sled the next morning. We loaded the trunk onto it and tied it down with the rope. The temperature was 8 degrees below zero. The sky was pale and empty, the kind of winter sky that made the world feel larger and lonelier than it actually was. We left before sunrise. No one came to see us off. No one waved. We simply walked out of Cedar Falls, pulling a sled with everything we owned, while Biscuit trotted ahead of us, his breath making small clouds in the frozen air. The journey took most of the day. We followed the landmarks the clerk had described, a split fence post leaning at an angle, a cottonwood tree twisted by years of wind into a shape that looked almost human, a dry creek bed buried under ice and snow. Every step was hard work. The sled runners kept catching on hidden rocks. The rope cut into my palms, even through my gloves. Nessa pulled from the front while I pushed from behind. We switched positions every quarter mile. Biscuit ranged ahead, following scents we couldn't detect, reading the landscape in ways we never would. Twice he stopped and barked, alerting us to places where the snow hid deeper drifts or unstable ice. We adjusted our path accordingly. By noon, my legs were burning, and my lungs ached from breathing air so cold it felt like swallowing knives.
Nessa's face was bright red, except for the white patches around her nose and cheeks that meant frostbite was starting to set in. We stopped long enough to eat dry bread and rub snow on her face to restore circulation. Then we kept moving, because stopping for too long meant freezing. The structure appeared in the distance around 2 in the afternoon. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow, a drift shaped by wind into something that only looked like human construction. But as we got closer, the shape solidified into reality. It sat alone in the middle of open plain, shaped exactly like Mr. Brennan had described, like a half-crushed loaf of bread made of rusted metal. The roof curved from one side to the other in a single sweep. The walls bowed inward slightly as they rose. 2 small windows stared out at us like eyes that had seen too much and expected nothing good. "That's it?" Nessa's voice was barely a whisper. "That's home." The word felt wrong in my mouth. This wasn't a home. It was a shelter, a shell, a place that might keep us alive if we were lucky and worked hard and didn't make too many mistakes. We pulled the sled up to the door. A wooden plank had been wedged across 2 iron hooks on the outside, barring entry. I lifted it free. The hinges screamed when I pushed the door open, a sound so sharp and lonely it seemed to echo across the entire plain. Inside, the air was colder than outside, if that was possible. A thin beam of light fell through a crack in the roof, revealing dust suspended in the stillness. The room was bigger than it looked from outside. One long space with a dirt floor frozen so hard it felt like stone beneath my feet. Against the back wall stood a small iron stove with a crooked pipe pushing up through the ceiling. A wooden bunk frame leaned to one side, its rope supports sagging. A rough table and 3 crates sat in a line like furniture abandoned mid-thought. Nessa pulled the trunk inside and shut the door behind us. The sudden absence of wind made the silence even heavier. Our breath hung between us in clouds that dispersed slowly. I walked to the stove and opened the firebox. Inside were gray ashes and a few blackened sticks. The last fire of a man who hadn't made it back. I touched the metal. It was so cold it stung. "It's colder in here than outside." Nessa wrapped her arms around herself. I didn't answer right away. I was studying the structure. The wooden ribs that curved upward like the frame of an overturned boat, the sheets of corrugated metal bolted to them, some rusted through to lace. Light slipped in through thin cracks where the metal had pulled away from the frame. But it's standing. I turned to look at my sister. That counts for something. Nessa's face was pale. "We can't live like this." No, I felt something harden in my chest. But we can change it. We went back outside to search the area. There were no trees nearby, just brittle grass and thorny brush that rattled in the wind. But farther east, beyond a shallow depression in the land, we found a dry gulch where old cottonwood and willow trees lay dead, but solid. Years of wind had stripped them bare, left the wood gray and hard as iron. Biscuit sniffed around the fallen timber while Nessa and I took stock. We'd need a saw. We'd need an axe. We'd need strength we didn't have and knowledge we barely possessed. We found a bow saw in one of the crates when we went back inside. The blade was rusty, but the teeth were still sharp. No axe, but there was a hatchet with a loose head that I could wedge tight with some work. We dragged dead branches back to the hut until the light began to fail. Nessa held them steady while I sawed through the wood in awkward, exhausting strokes. When my arms gave out, Nessa took the saw without being asked and kept going. By dark, we had a small pile of firewood leaning against the door. Inside, I cleared the ashes from the stove, while Nessa tightened the loose joints of the stovepipe with wire we found wrapped around one of the crates. We tore pages from an old almanac and built a careful nest of paper and splinters in the firebox. I struck the flint over and over, my hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. 15 strikes. 20. Then a spark caught. The paper flared orange, the wood cracked softly. Smoke rose and hesitated, trapped under the curved roof. Nessa coughed. I held my breath. Then the draft took the smoke and pulled it upward through the pipe and out into the night. Heat crept out from the iron in small, uncertain waves. Not enough, not nearly enough. But it was something. That night we slept in our coats on the bare bunk, pressed close together, with Biscuit wedged between us, and the trunk pushed up against the wall. Outside, the wind clawed at the metal roof, with sounds that seemed alive. The cold pushed through every gap and crack, turning the air inside into something sharp and hostile. I lay awake, listening, feeling the cold seep into my bones, feeling my sister shiver beside me, feeling Biscuit's warmth against my ribs, like the last ember of a dying fire. We'd crossed the line. There was no store to return to, no warm room waiting. Only this crooked shelter, and whatever we could make of it. Morning came with light so pale it barely counted as dawn. Frost had formed on the inside of the windows, in patterns that looked like ferns or feathers. Delicate, beautiful, deadly. I slid off the bunk and fed the stove until flames climbed again. The room slowly breathed back to life, though the temperature couldn't have been more than 5 degrees above zero. In daylight, the place looked worse. The dirt floor was frozen hard as granite. Every step sent cold straight up through my boots and into my legs. The roof sagged where the stovepipe pushed through, and thin lines of daylight showed where the metal had pulled away from the frame. Nessa hugged herself, her breath making clouds. This thing wasn't meant for winter. No, I agreed. But it doesn't have to stay this way. We walked the length of the room, studying it like a problem that could be solved. The wooden ribs were strong despite their age. The structure faced south, catching what little sun winter gave. It wasn't a home, but it had bones. Biscuit nosed around the crates and barked once. I went to look. He'd found a wooden box wedged behind the largest crate, covered in dust and cobwebs. I pulled it out carefully. The lid was warped, but it opened. Inside were papers. A journal bound in cracked leather, some letters tied with string, and at the bottom, a note in handwriting that looked like it had been written quickly, the letters uneven and urgent. To whoever finds this, my name is Ezra Pike. If you're reading this, I'm likely dead. This place kept me alive through 7 winters. It can keep you alive too, if you're willing to work. Everything you need to know is in this journal. Read it. Learn it. Live. I opened the journal. 47 pages of dense handwriting, diagrams, instructions, observations about wind patterns and snow loads, and how to keep heat from escaping through a dozen different gaps. Nessa looked over my shoulder. She was reading too. Then we heard it. Footsteps crunching through snow outside. Heavy, deliberate. Biscuit's ears went up, and he moved toward the door, his body tense but not aggressive. I opened the door before whoever it was could knock. An old man stood there, 70 at least, maybe older. He had a white beard that reached his chest and pale eyes that seemed to see through surface things. He wore a coat made from animal hide and a hat that looked like it had been fashioned from wolf fur. "You girls alive in there?" His accent was thick. German, I thought. He looked past me into the hut, his gaze taking in everything. The thin pile of firewood, the smoking stove, the 2 of us in our threadbare coats. "I'm Joseph Weaver."
He gestured vaguely west.
Live over the ridge.
I knew the name. The clerk had mentioned him. The hermit, who barely counted as human company. I'm Willa Thorne. I gestured to Nessa. This is my sister, Nessa. He nodded once. Then he looked at the hut again and shook his head slowly. You won't last 3 days like this. The words hit like a physical blow. Nessa stiffened beside me. We don't have anywhere else to go. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Joseph Weaver studied us for a long moment.
His eyes were sharp despite his age. Assessing. Calculating. You got Ezra's journal. I held it up. Good. He reached into his coat and pulled out another journal, this one bound in faded cloth. This was Ezra's too. More detailed. How to make the floor. How to build walls that hold heat. How to survive. He handed it to me. I don't teach. I'm too old and too tired. But Ezra was a good man. He wrote everything down because he knew someday someone desperate enough would end up here. His hand went back into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth.
Inside was a third journal, this one much older. The cover was water-stained and the pages were yellowed with age. This belonged to a woman named Catherine Mitchell, found it in Ezra's things after he died. She lived in Dakota Territory 20 years ago, survived alone for a decade, wrote down everything she learned. My hands went numb. Catherine Mitchell. Our mother's maiden name. Our mother.
I looked at Nessa. Her face had gone white. Weaver was watching us carefully.
She's your mother. Not a question, a statement. Was. He nodded. Thought the name looked familiar when I heard it at the county office. He gestured to the journals. These are yours now. Read them. Learn from people who survived this land. Do the work yourself. If you live through it, you'll deserve to. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back. One more thing. There's a woman in town named Whitmore.
She came out here 2 days ago. Wanted to know who bought the land.
I told her. She didn't look happy. What does she want? Weaver shrugged. Nothing good. Watch yourselves. Then he walked away, his footsteps crunching through the snow until the sound faded into the wind. I stood in the doorway holding 3 journals, 2 from Ezra Pike, 1 from our mother. Knowledge written down by people who'd faced exactly what we were facing, who'd survived, who'd learned.
Nessa was staring at the journal that had belonged to our mother. Her hands were shaking.
Mama knew. Her voice cracked. She knew how to do this. She survived this exact thing. She did. I felt something settle in my chest. Something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't despair either. And she wrote it down for us. We went inside and closed the door. Biscuit curled up near the stove. Nessa opened our mother's journal, while I opened Ezra's detailed one.
The first page of Ezra's journal had neat, careful handwriting.
Day 1. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. But this place can keep you alive, if you're willing to work. First, the floor. Cold comes from below. You must stop it. I turned the page, found detailed instructions, diagrams showing how to dig frozen earth, how to pack it in layers, how to create an insulated floor that would stop the cold from rising.
Nessa was reading from my mother's journal, her finger tracing the words.
June 1867. Today I wanted to die. The Dakota winter took everything I'd saved, everything I'd built. But I kept breathing. For the spring. For the future. For the daughters I hadn't yet met. Her voice broke on the last words. I reached across the space between us and took her hand. Our scars pressed together. The marks that made us the same. Outside, the wind howled.
Inside we had fire and shelter,
and the words of the dead teaching us how to live. We chose cold over separation. We chose risk over slow disappearance. And now we knew what that choice would demand. Everything.
The first instruction in Ezra's journal was deceptively simple.
Dig the frozen earth near the outer walls. Carry it inside. Let the fire thaw it. Pack it in layers 3 inches deep. Let each layer freeze solid before adding the next. Simple on paper, brutal in practice. We started the next morning after feeding the stove with the last of our small wood pile. I found a broken shovel half buried in snow outside, the handle splintered but usable.
Nessa wrapped her hands in strips torn from our spare stockings because we had no proper work gloves.
The ground resisted every strike. Each impact sent shockwaves up my arms and into my shoulders. The soil came away in chunks hard as river stones, gray and stubborn. Biscuit watched us work, his head tilted, occasionally nosing at the frozen earth as if trying to understand what we were doing. We carried the chunks inside in the wooden crates, stacking them near the stove.
The heat transformed them slowly. Ice became water. Hard earth became workable mud. We spread the thawed soil across the floor with our bare hands, pressing it down with our boots and the flat of the shovel blade. By the third day, my palms had split open, raw cracks that wept clear fluid and stung whenever I flexed my fingers. Nessa's hands looked worse. The skin around her knuckles had torn completely, leaving meat exposed. She wrapped my hands with cloth torn from the hem of my spare dress. Her fingers were gentle, despite their own damage. I did the same for her, binding the wounds tight enough to hold the skin together, but loose enough that she could still grip the shovel. We didn't talk much during the work. Talking wasted breath, and we needed every bit of air for the labor. But sometimes at night, lying on the bunk with Biscuit between us, and our hands throbbing in unison, Messa would whisper questions into the darkness. "Do you think Mama really did this? Built a floor like this?" I would reach for the journal and read by the dim light of the single candle we allowed ourselves each night. June 1868. The floor is complete. 4 weeks of digging. My hands may never heal properly, but the cold no longer rises through my feet like water through a drowning woman's lungs. "Yes," I answered. "She did exactly this. The work consumed us. We fell into a rhythm dictated entirely by survival. Wake before dawn, feed the fire, eat bread so dry it hurt to swallow, dig until our backs screamed, haul earth, spread, pack, wait for it to freeze, start again." On the 4th day, the floor was noticeably higher. 2 inches. Then 3. The cold that had been seeping up from below began to ease. Not warmth, exactly, but the absence of that bone-deep chill that made standing in one place feel like standing on ice. Nessa noticed it first. She stomped her foot and looked at me with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. "It's working." The 5th layer went down on the 7th day. We sprinkled melted snow across the surface and let it turn to ice overnight. In the morning, the floor was solid, hard, real. When I walked across it, the cold no longer shot straight up through my boots and into my bones. Nessa stood in the center of the room and turned in a slow circle. "Different." Her voice was barely audible. "It actually feels different." But the walls were still thin metal, with gaps that let wind whistle through, like the hut was playing a broken instrument. At night, the temperature inside barely climbed above freezing, even with the fire burning constantly. We were using wood faster than we could gather it. I opened Ezra's journal to the section on walls. The diagrams showed layers, wooden ribs on the inside, then what he called sod bricks, blocks of earth and grass roots cut from the prairie and stacked like masonry against the metal exterior. Nessa read over my shoulder. "We don't have bricks. We make them." Our mother's journal had a section on cutting sod. She'd built a dugout in Dakota using the same technique. The instructions were precise. Cut rectangles 18 inches by 12 inches by 6 inches deep. Use the grass roots to hold the earth together. Stack them like you would stack stones for a wall. Each brick would weigh about 30 pounds according to her notes. We'd need roughly 200 bricks to cover the exterior walls in a double layer thick enough to trap air and stop the wind. 200 bricks. 6,000 pounds of earth. Cut by hand, carried by 2 girls and a dog who weighed less than 120 pounds combined. We started cutting the next morning. The shovel blade had to slice through the frozen top layer first, then down through 6 inches of earth dense with the root systems of prairie grass. The roots were what mattered. They wove through the soil like thread through fabric, holding everything together in a mat so tangled that the bricks wouldn't crumble when we lifted them. The first brick took an hour, 3 careful cuts to define the rectangle. Then sliding the blade underneath, working it back and forth until the whole piece lifted free as a single unit. It was heavier than I expected. My arms shook holding it. Roots dangled from the bottom like hair. Nessa helped me carry it to the wall. We positioned it against the base, fitting it tight against the wooden ribs. Loose soil fell away from the edges. I packed the gaps with mud made from thawed earth and snowmelt. 1 brick, 199 to go. We worked in a pattern. I cut while Nessa carried. When my arms gave out from cutting, we switched. When both of us were too exhausted to lift another brick, we stopped and gathered wood instead. When we couldn't gather wood anymore, we collapsed on the bunk and slept without dreaming. The work destroyed our bodies in incremental ways. My back developed a permanent ache that started at my tailbone and spread up my spine like fire climbing a fuse. Nessa's shoulders began to slope forward from the constant hauling. Both of us developed calluses on top of our existing wounds, layers of damaged tissue that hardened into something resembling armor. Biscuit helped in ways we didn't expect. He learned to grab the smaller bricks in his teeth and drag them short distances. Sometimes he'd find sections of prairie where the soil was slightly softer, barking to get our attention. We followed his lead, and the cutting went faster there. On the 10th day, my right hand seized up completely. The muscles locked into a claw shape and wouldn't release. Nessa had to pry my fingers open one at a time, massaging the cramped tendons until they reluctantly loosened. When I tried to grip the shovel again, my hand wouldn't close properly. We stopped, sat in the snow. Nessa's face was streaked with dirt, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from the constant exposure to wind. "I can't do this anymore." Her voice came out flat, empty. "I'm sorry. I just can't." It was the first time she'd admitted defeat. I looked at her and saw what I must look like. Filthy, gaunt, marked by labor in ways that would probably never fully heal. We'd been at this for 2 weeks, and we'd only completed about 60 bricks, not even a third of what we needed. The wind picked up and blew snow across our laps. Biscuit whined and pressed his body against Nessa's side. I pulled her mother's journal from inside my coat, where I kept it to prevent the pages from freezing. Found the entry I'd read a dozen times but never shared with my sister. November, 1867. The words were written in ink that had faded to brown. Today I broke down, sobbed until I couldn't breathe, screamed at the sky, cursed God and this land and my own foolishness for thinking I could survive here alone. Then I washed my face in snow, ate a piece of bread, went back to work. Because the only thing worse than this suffering is the suffering that comes from giving up. I read it aloud. My voice sounded strange, speaking our mother's words. When I finished, Nessa was crying.
not the quiet tears she usually shed at night. These were sobs that shook her whole body. I crawled through the snow and wrapped my arms around her. She buried her face in my shoulder and wept like something inside her had finally cracked open. I held her and let her cry, because there was nothing else I could do, nothing else that mattered. When she finally stopped, her face was swollen and her breath came in hiccups. But her eyes had changed. Something had shifted behind them. Mama didn't quit. Her voice was raw. "No, we're not going to quit either. No." We sat there for another minute. Then Nessa stood up, wiped her face with her sleeve, picked up the shovel, started cutting the next brick. I watched her for a moment, then I stood and helped her lift it. By the end of the third week, the walls had transformed. Sawed bricks covered the lower half of the metal exterior in thick, irregular layers that made the structure look like it was growing out of the earth rather than sitting on top of it. The gaps between bricks were packed with mud that froze hard as mortar. The wind no longer whistled through the cracks. Inside, the temperature began to hold. 40 degrees during the day when the fire burned steadily, 35 at night when we banked the coals and let them smolder. Not warm, but survivable. We needed to go back to town for supplies. Our food was nearly gone. The last of the bread had turned to blue mold, and the beans were almost depleted. We had maybe 3 days left if we rationed carefully. The walk back felt longer than the walk out. Our bodies had changed in the weeks since we left. Thinner, harder, marked by work in ways that showed clearly despite our attempts to clean ourselves before entering town. People stared. Mrs. Peterson looked at me like I was a stranger when I walked into her shop. "My goodness, you look like you've been living in the wild." I handed her 2 shirts I'd managed to finish by candlelight over the past week. The stitching wasn't my best work, but it was acceptable. She examined them carefully, her mouth pursed. "These will do." She counted out 30 cents and placed the coins in my palm. Her fingers didn't touch mine. Then she looked at my hands, really looked at them. The scars, the calluses, the fingernails broken down to the quick. "What have you been doing out there?" "Building." She blinked. "Building what?" "A home." At the general store, Mr. Brennan greeted us with something approaching warmth. He'd always been kind in his quiet way, but even he seemed taken aback by our appearance. "Girls!" He leaned across the counter. "You're looking peaked. You eating enough?" "We're managing." He studied us for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled a sack of flour from the shelf and set it on the counter. Then a smaller bag of dried beans, a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, a jar of rendered fat for cooking. "Consider it credit." His voice was gruff. "Pay me back when you can." My throat tightened. "We can't take charity." "It's not charity. It's good business. Can't have my former employees starving to death. Bad for my reputation." He said it like a joke, but his eyes were serious. I nodded once. "Thank you." Outside, we loaded the supplies into an old crate Mr. Brennan let us keep. As we were tying everything down, 3 women from the church congregation walked past. I recognized them. Mrs. Morrison and her 2 daughters, Sarah and Rebecca. They'd brought food to our house after the funeral. They stopped when they saw us. Mrs. Morrison's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for me to name them all. Concern, pity, something that might have been disgust. Willa, Nessa. She smoothed her skirt. "We heard you moved out to that place." "Yes, ma'am." "Are you well?" She looked pointedly at our hands. "We're learning." "Learning what?" "To survive." The word hung between us. Her daughters whispered to each other behind their hands.
Mrs. Morrison's face softened slightly. The church can help, you know.
We have funds. We could find you proper lodgings.
We have lodgings. That's not what I heard. Her voice took on an edge. I heard you're living in a metal shed with no well and no proper walls. That's not fitting for young women. It's fitting for us. Her mouth tightened. Pride is a sin, Willa. Your mother knew that. The mention of our mother felt like a slap. Nessa's hand found mine and squeezed hard enough to hurt. Our mother survived worse. My voice came out harder than I intended,
And she taught us how. We walked away before she could respond. Behind us, I heard the women start talking immediately. Their voices carried on the cold air, but I couldn't make out the words. Didn't need to. The tone was enough. At the edge of town, we passed the boarding house. Mrs. Whitmore was standing on the porch. She watched us approach with her arms folded across her chest.
Still alive, I see.
Her voice was sharp enough to cut.
How surprising.
We kept walking. Didn't acknowledge her, but she wasn't finished. Deputy Miller came by yesterday, asked me some questions about you girls, about whether you were being properly supervised, about whether the county should perhaps intervene for your own safety. I stopped, turned to face her. And what did you tell him? I told him the truth, that you're two orphaned girls living in squalor, that you're clearly not capable of caring for yourselves, that the Christian thing to do would be to find you proper homes with proper families. Nessa's breathing had gone shallow beside me. I kept my voice level. Did you tell him we own the land legally? That we've broken no laws? Mrs. Whitmore's smile was thin. I told him everything he needed to know. He said he'd come check on you within the week. Make sure you're suitable. The word suitable dripped with implications. I looked at her for a long moment, saw the malice there, the satisfaction. She wanted us to fail, needed us to fail. Let him come. We have nothing to hide. We'll see about that. The walk back to the hut took until dusk. We pulled the loaded crate behind us on the sled. Biscuit ranged ahead, occasionally circling back to check on us. My mind was churning through Mrs. Whitmore's words. Deputy Miller would come. He'd see the hut. He'd make a judgment about whether we were fit to live independently. That night, after we'd eaten beans cooked in the rendered fat and stored the rest of the supplies in the crates, Nessa pulled out our father's letters. We'd been carrying them since we left town, but hadn't opened them yet. The grief was still too fresh. But now Nessa unfolded the first one. The paper was soft. The handwriting was our father's careful script, each letter formed with the precision of a man who'd learned to write as an adult and never lost his reverence for the skill. My dearest girls, if you're reading this, I'm gone. The thought of leaving you alone in this world breaks my heart in ways I cannot express in words. But know this. You are stronger than you think. Together, you can survive anything. Your mother showed me what true strength looks like. She survived years alone before I met her. That strength lives in you. Trust it. Trust each other. And remember that love is not something you find. It's something you build. With work, with sacrifice, with choosing each other every single day, even when it would be easier to walk away. The letter went on, but Nessa's hands were shaking too badly to keep reading. I took it from her and read the rest aloud. Our father's voice in my head, speaking wisdom he'd learned too late to tell us in person. When I finished, we sat in silence. The fire crackled. Biscuit sighed and shifted his weight. Outside, the wind had picked up. He knew. Nessa's voice was barely a whisper. He knew we might end up like this. Alone. Fighting to survive. Maybe. I folded the letter carefully. Or maybe he just knew that life is hard, and he wanted us to be ready. We read the other 2 letters over the following nights. Each one held different wisdom, different encouragement, different pieces of our Father trying to prepare us for a future he wouldn't be part of. The work continued. We finished the walls, 200 bricks, every single one cut and carried and placed by hands that would carry the scars forever. The transformation was remarkable. The hut no longer looked like a piece of salvage dropped randomly on the prairie. It looked deliberate, built, permanent. Joseph Weaver came by 3 weeks after his first visit. He walked around the exterior, running his hand along the sod walls, checking the joints where we'd packed mud. His expression gave nothing away. "You followed the instructions." We did. "No help?" "Just the journals." He nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. It transformed his severe face into something almost grandfatherly. "You'll live through winter. Maybe longer." It felt like a blessing from a priest. We'd earned his approval through work and suffering and refusing to quit. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle. "Seed for spring. Turnips, carrots, hardy greens. Plant them when the ground thaws. They'll grow fast if you water them." "We don't have a well." "Rain barrels." He pointed to places around the hut where the roof would funnel water. "Put barrels there. The roof will fill them. You'll have water for cooking and washing and plants." He turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. That woman Whitmore sent the deputy out here yesterday. He came to my place asking questions. I told him you were hard workers, that you'd improved the property, that you were no trouble. What did he say?" "That he'd come see for himself." Weaver left. We looked at each other. The deputy would come. We'd known it was inevitable. But knowing and experiencing were different things. We spent the next 2 days cleaning, swept the floor until it was smooth, organized our supplies neatly in the crates, made the bunk with our quilt spread carefully across it, scrubbed our faces and hands, and tried to make ourselves look like respectable young women instead of feral creatures who'd been living in dirt for a month. Deputy Miller arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. He was a large man, with a thick mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He tied his horse outside and knocked on the door with authority. "Miss Thorne," his voice was official, "I'm here to check on your living situation, make sure everything is appropriate." I opened the door wider. "Please, come in." He stepped inside and looked around. His eyes took in the dirt floor, the sod walls visible through the gaps in the metal sheeting, the small stove, the single bunk, the trunk, the crates, everything we owned visible in one glance. "This is where you're living?" "Yes, sir." "Just the 2 of you?" "And our dog." Biscuit sat by the stove, watching the deputy with alert interest. Miller walked the length of the room, tested the floor with his boot, examined the stove, looked at our food supplies. Finally, he turned back to face us. "Mrs. Whitmore suggested you weren't capable of caring for yourselves." "Mrs. Whitmore isn't here." He almost smiled. "No, she isn't." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "You built these walls yourself?" "Yes, sir, following instructions from journals left by the previous owner." "The floor?" "Same." He made notes. Then he looked at our hands, at the scars and calluses, at the evidence of work that went beyond what most young women ever experienced. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Thorne. When I got the complaint, I expected to find 2 girls in over their heads, maybe freezing, maybe starving, maybe desperate enough to accept help. We're not desperate." "No." He closed his notebook. "You're not. You're clearly managing. The structure is sound. You have food, heat. You own the land legally. I see no reason to intervene."
Relief washed through me so powerfully, my knees almost buckled. However, he held up one hand. If circumstances change, if you need help, the county can provide assistance. There's no shame in asking. We'll remember that. He left.
We watched through the window as he mounted his horse and rode away. When he was out of sight, Nessa turned to me with tears streaming down her face. But she was laughing. A sound I hadn't heard in months.
We did it.
Her voice was high and shaky.
He saw us, and we passed.
I started laughing too. We held each other and laughed until our sides hurt, until Biscuit started barking in confusion, until the absurdity of our situation crashed over us in waves we couldn't control. We were 17 and 16. We'd built shelter from nothing. We'd earned the approval of a hermit and a lawman. We'd proven Mrs. Whitmore wrong. But winter wasn't finished with us yet. The weather turned strange in early March. Warm days that melted the snow into muddy streams. Blue skies that fooled birds into returning early. Nessa started talking about spring like it was already here. But one morning, Biscuit refused to go outside. He stood at the door and whined, his body tense, his ears flat against his head. When I finally forced the door open, he backed away and returned to his spot by the stove. The sky looked wrong. Not gray, not blue. The color of pewter left to tarnish, dull and heavy and threatening in ways I couldn't articulate but felt in my bones. Joseph Weaver appeared an hour later, riding a horse I'd never seen him use before. His face was grim. Storm coming, the worst kind, late season. He looked at the hut. You've done good work, but this will test it. How long do we have? Maybe 12 hours, maybe less. He dismounted and helped us drag every piece of wood we'd gathered into the hut, filled our water containers from melted snow, checked the stovepipe one more time. When he was satisfied, he gripped my shoulder once. Stay inside no matter what you hear. Keep the fire going. You'll live. Then he rode away into the strange light. We spent the afternoon preparing, plugged every gap we could find with mud and cloth, stacked wood within arm's reach of the stove, filled our largest pot with snow to melt for water. Nessa baked the last of our bread so we'd have food that didn't need cooking if the fire went out. The temperature began dropping around 3 in the afternoon, 20 degrees in an hour, then 10 more. The wind shifted, coming hard from the north with a sound like something wounded and angry. By dusk, the storm arrived. It didn't build gradually. It came like a wall. One moment the world was visible through our window. The next, everything disappeared into white fury. Wind slammed into the hut with force that made the metal walls boom like drums. Snow flew horizontal, particles so fine and fast they made sounds like sand against glass. The temperature plummeted. 0. Then 10 below. Then 20 below 0. We fed the fire constantly. The stove glowed red, but the heat it produced struggled to fill the room. The cold pressed in from every direction, finding every microscopic gap in our walls, every place where our work wasn't quite perfect. Nessa's breath came out in clouds so thick they looked solid. My hands shook from more than cold. This was different from anything we'd experienced. This was winter showing us what it could really do when it wanted to kill. That first night lasted forever. We took turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts, one of us always awake to tend the fire, to make sure the stove never went out. Because if it did, we'd freeze before we could get it started again. Biscuit lay between us, conserving his heat, his eyes moving from me to Nessa and back like he was counting to make sure we were both still alive. Morning came without light. The windows were buried under snow. We were sealed in, entombed.
The only illumination came from the fire. Nessa started coughing around noon on the second day, deep, rattling coughs that came from her lungs and wouldn't stop. Her face flushed red with the effort. I made her drink water, made her sit close to the stove, but the coughing continued. That night was worse. The wind howled with sounds that seemed almost human, screaming, wailing. Biscuit whined and pressed himself against the wall. Nessa coughed until she couldn't catch her breath. Her eyes went wide with panic. I grabbed her shoulders. Look at me. Breathe with me. She tried. Failed. Tried again. Her chest heaved. She was hyperventilating, making it worse. I did the only thing I could think of. I started singing. The hymn our mother used to sing, Amazing Grace. My voice shook. The notes came out wrong, but I kept singing. Nessa's eyes focused on my face. Her breathing slowed slightly, still ragged but no longer the desperate gasping of someone drowning in air. I sang the whole hymn, then started it again. By the third verse, Nessa was breathing almost normally. By the time I finished, she'd fallen asleep sitting up, her head against my shoulder. I held her and listened to the storm try to tear our shelter apart. The sod walls held. The floor we'd built kept the cold from rising. The stove we'd fed so carefully kept pushing heat into the space. Everything Ezra wrote in his journal, everything our mother learned in Dakota, everything we'd built with our bleeding hands, all of it was being tested right now. And it was holding. The third day, the wind finally began to ease. Not stopping, just lessening. The constant roar dropped to a howl, then to a moan, then to something that sounded almost normal. On the fourth morning, silence woke me. Complete silence. No wind, no creaking metal, nothing. I slid off the bunk carefully, trying not to wake Nessa. Biscuit lifted his head and watched me. I fed the fire, then I took the shovel and began digging. The snow had drifted against the door, packing it tight. I dug upward at an angle, pushing snow back and to the sides, creating a tunnel. My arms screamed from the work. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold. 30 minutes of digging. Then the shovel broke through, and daylight rushed in like water. I climbed out into a transformed world. The prairie was gone. In its place lay an ocean of snow, sculpted by wind into waves and drifts that reached 5 feet high in places. The sky was so blue, it hurt to look at. The air so clear, every breath felt like inhaling knives. And 5 miles away, in the direction of Cedar Falls, a column of black smoke rose into the perfect sky. Not the thin gray smoke of cook stoves and fireplaces. This was thick, dark. The smoke of something burning that wasn't supposed to burn. Nessa climbed out behind me, Biscuit scrambling up after her. We stood together, looking at that smoke. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. The church. Nessa's voice was barely audible. Or someone's house. Or the school. We need to go back. I looked at her thin face, her hands still wrapped in bandages, at the exhaustion written into every line of her body. We barely survived 3 days here. Walking 5 miles through snow this deep will take hours, maybe all day. We could die on the way. She met my eyes. And if we don't go, they might die anyway. Biscuit barked once, a sharp, clear sound in the crystalline air. He was already moving, breaking trail through the snow, choosing a path that avoided the deepest drifts. We went back inside, packed what food we could carry, filled a canteen with water. I took the knife our father left us. Nessa took the rope.
We dressed in every layer we owned and still felt the cold immediately. Then we started walking. Biscuit led. We followed in his tracks. The snow reached our thighs in places, our hips in others.
Every step required lifting our entire leg clear and plunging it down again. Within half an hour, my thighs were burning. Within an hour, I couldn't feel my feet. We stopped only when we couldn't go any farther without rest. Ate snow for water. Ate bread so frozen it had to thaw in our mouths before we could chew. Then we kept moving, because stopping for too long meant freezing. 2 hours into the walk, Biscuit stopped and barked. A different sound. Urgent, alert.
I pushed forward to see what he'd found. A boy, maybe 8 years old, half buried in a drift, his lips blue, his eyes glassy. I recognized him. Billy Patterson. His father owned the hardware store. He's alive. Barely. Nessa dropped to her knees and started digging him out. We pulled him free and wrapped him in our spare blanket. He was conscious but couldn't speak, couldn't stand. I picked him up and he weighed almost nothing. We'd have to carry him the rest of the way. 3 more hours. The sun dropped toward the horizon. The temperature began falling again. My back screamed from carrying Billy. Nessa's face was completely white except for dark circles under her eyes. But Biscuit kept moving, and we kept following. Cedar Falls appeared like a mirage. At first, I thought I was seeing things. Then the buildings solidified. Real. There, the scene was chaos. The Methodist church was a collapsed ruin. The roof had buckled under snow load. The stove inside had tipped when the structure fell, and fire had consumed what remained. Smoke still rose from the blackened timbers. Families stood in clusters, children crying. Old people wrapped in blankets sitting in the snow because there was nowhere else to go. The boarding house was packed beyond capacity. We could see people pressed against every window. Constable Davis saw us first. He was a solid man in his 50s who usually radiated competence. Now, he just looked exhausted.
Willa! Nessa! His voice cracked slightly. You made it.
Billy Patterson was in the snow. I held the boy out. He needs warmth. Davis took him and shouted for someone to help. Then he turned back to us. 41 people lost their homes. Church collapsed. 3 houses crushed. We've got them split between the boarding house and private homes, but we're out of space. Night's coming. Temperatures dropping. I don't know what to do. I looked at Nessa. She looked back at me.
We'd survived because we built shelter, because we prepared, because we learned from people who came before us. Our place is still standing. The words came out before I'd fully thought them through. It's warm. We can take people. Silence spread outward from where we stood. Faces turned toward us. I saw recognition, confusion, disbelief. Mrs. Whitmore pushed through the crowd. She looked at us with something that might have been triumph. That shack? You're joking. It's not a shack anymore. Nessa's voice was stronger than mine. We built it to last. It held through the storm. It's 5 miles away. Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose. In this snow? Impossible. I met her eyes. We just walked it, with Billy Patterson. The constable looked from us to the crowd to the ruined church. Then he made a decision. Anyone who can walk, pack light. We leave in 30 minutes. Mrs. Whitmore's face went white with fury, but there was nothing she could say. The constable had spoken. People moved, gathered belongings, wrapped children in blankets. Someone brought 2 wagons for those who couldn't walk. Old Mr. Thompson, who was 73, Mrs. Morrison with her daughter Rosalie, who was burning with fever. The Patterson family. 41 people.
all of them trusting that two teenage girls had built something real enough to save them. We led them out of town as the sun touched the horizon. Biscuit out front, breaking trail, choosing the path. Behind us came a line of people that stretched back like a dark ribbon laid across white snow. And somewhere in my chest, beneath the exhaustion and fear and doubt, I felt something that might have been pride. We'd chosen to stay together. We'd chosen to build. And now we were becoming shelter for others. The journey back took 4 hours, twice as long as it should have. The wagons sank into drifts and had to be dug out by men whose hands were already numb. Children cried from cold and fear until their mothers hushed them with promises no one could guarantee. Old Mr. Thompson fell twice. The second time he couldn't get up on his own and had to be lifted onto the wagon with the other elderly. I walked at the front with Biscuit. The dog had an instinct for finding the shallowest routes, the places where wind had scoured snow down to manageable depths. When he veered left or right, I followed without question. Behind me, 40 people trusted that a 17-year-old girl and a dog knew where they were going. Nessa walked beside Mrs. Morrison, who carried 5-year-old Rosalie wrapped in 3 blankets. The child's face was flushed, dark red. Her breathing came fast and shallow. Every few minutes she would whimper, and her mother would murmur something I couldn't hear. The Pattersons brought up the rear with Billy, who'd regained consciousness but still couldn't walk properly. His father carried him on his back, switching with his older son every half-mile. The sun slid lower. Shadows stretched across the snow, like fingers reaching. Temperature dropped with each passing minute. I could feel it in the way the air started to bite exposed skin more sharply. Mrs. Whitmore walked in the middle of the group, silent, her face unreadable. She hadn't spoken since we left town, except to accept a blanket someone offered her. I caught her looking at me once. She turned away quickly. When the hut finally came into view, the group stopped. Just stopped walking. I heard murmurs, confusion. Someone whispered something about it looking different. It did look different. The sod walls had darkened during the storm, the earth compressed and frozen into something that resembled stone more than dirt. Snow had drifted against one side, but the structure itself stood firm and square against the landscape. Smoke rose from the stovepipe in a thin, steady line. That's it? A man I didn't know voiced the question several people were thinking. That's what's going to save us? It will if you give it a chance. I started walking again. Biscuit bounded ahead, barking once as he reached the door. I'd left the fire banked before we departed. Now I opened the door and heat rolled out like something alive. The contrast with the outside air was so stark that several people gasped. Inside, quickly. Constable Davis took charge, helping people through the door. Families first, children, elderly, then everyone else. They filled the space like water, finding every available gap. Families sat shoulder to shoulder along the walls, children curled in laps. Old Mr. Thompson and 3 other elderly men took the spots closest to the stove. The Morrison family settled near the corner where I kept our trunk. 41 people. The mathematics of human bodies in confined space. Roughly 5 square feet per person. No room to lie down. Barely room to sit without touching neighbors. But the walls we'd built held heat. The floor we'd laid kept cold from rising. The stove we'd installed burned steady. People who'd been shivering violently began to still. Color returned to faces that had gone gray with cold. Children stopped crying. Nessa moved to the stove and began building up the fire. I checked our wood supply. Enough for tonight if we were careful. Tomorrow we'd need to gather more, but tomorrow wasn't here yet. Constable Davis found me near the door. His expression had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but something else had joined it. Something like wonder. You really did this. He looked around the space. Built all this? We had help.
I gestured to Ezra's journal sitting on top of the trunk. Instructions from the man who lived here before. And my mother's journal. She knew this life. He nodded slowly. Then his gaze moved to where Mrs. Morrison sat with Rosalie. The child was worse. Her breathing had become labored. She wasn't responding when her mother spoke to her. That little one needs a doctor. Closest doctor is 15 miles. Roads are impassable. His jaw tightened. Then she needs a miracle. I moved through the packed bodies to where the Morrisons sat. Adelaide Morrison looked up at me with eyes that held a mother's particular terror, the kind that comes from watching your child slip away and being helpless to stop it. How long has she been like this? 2 days. The fever came on fast after the storm started. I knelt beside them, touched Rosalie's forehead. The heat radiating from her skin was wrong, dangerous. I'd felt this kind of heat before, when our mother was dying. May I try something? Mrs. Morrison's expression flickered between hope and suspicion. You're not a doctor. No, but my mother survived 10 years alone in Dakota Territory. She learned things, wrote them down. I retrieved our mother's journal and turned to the section I'd read a dozen times but never needed to use. Remedies for common ailments. Treatments for fever. The handwriting was cramped here, as if our mother had been writing quickly, urgently, recording knowledge before she forgot it. For high fever in children, willow bark tea if available. If not, cool cloths to forehead, wrists, and feet. Keep them drinking, even if they resist. Steam from hot water helps breathing. Watch for the crisis point, usually around 104 degrees. If they survive that, the fever will break. I read it aloud so Mrs. Morrison could hear. She listened with the intensity of someone being thrown a rope while drowning. Do you have willow bark? I looked at Nessa. She shook her head. We'd seen willow trees in the gulch where we gathered wood, but in winter the bark would be frozen solid to the trunk. Impossible to harvest quickly. Then we do what we can with what we have. I stood and moved to our supplies, found our cleanest cloth, soaked it in melted snow water. The next hours blurred into a rhythm of crisis and response. I kept cool cloths on Rosalie's forehead, changing them every few minutes as they absorbed her fever heat. Nessa boiled water, and we held Rosalie's face over the steam, letting her breathe the moisture that might ease her labored breathing. Mrs. Morrison helped hold her daughter, stroked her hair, whispered things I couldn't hear. Other people in the hut watched. Some prayed quietly, some simply sat in silence. The space had transformed from a shelter into something else. A vigil. A waiting room between life and death. Around midnight, Rosalie's temperature peaked. Her skin burned so hot I could barely keep my hand against it. Her eyes rolled back. Her breathing went shallow and rapid, like a trapped bird. She's dying, Mrs. Morrison's voice broke. My baby's dying. Not yet. I don't know where the certainty in my voice came from. Maybe from desperation. Maybe from the memory of our mother's words written in ink that had faded but not disappeared. She's fighting. We fight with her. I pressed the cloth against her forehead and whispered words I didn't know I remembered. Words our mother used to say when Nessa or I were sick. Hold on. Just hold on. Morning is coming. An hour passed. Then another. Rosalie's breathing changed, steadied slightly. The awful heat began to ease. Not much, but enough. At 3 a.m, the fever broke. Sweat poured from Rosalie's skin, soaking through her clothes and the blankets. Her breathing deepened. Her color shifted from that dangerous red toward something closer to normal. Mrs. Morrison sobbed. Not from grief this time, from relief so profound it bent her double. She clutched her daughter and wept into the child's damp hair. I sat back against the wall.
My hands were shaking. Nessa appeared beside me with a cup of water. I drank without tasting it. Around us, people had witnessed something. I could see it in their faces. Not just a child recovering from fever. Something larger.
A demonstration that this place, this rough shelter built by two orphaned girls, could actually sustain life.
You saved her. Constable Davis's voice was quiet. How did you know what to do? I held up the journal. My mother taught me. Even though she's gone, she's still teaching me. He looked at the journal for a long moment, then at me. You're not what anyone expected, are you? I didn't know how to answer that. Didn't try. The rest of the night passed in relative quiet. Rosalie slept.
Her fever stayed down. People dozed sitting up, heads against shoulders, bodies finding whatever comfort could be stolen in cramped quarters. I stayed awake, tended the fire, made sure the heat kept circulating. Biscuit lay with his head on my lap, his warmth grounding me. In the dim firelight, I could see faces. Families pressed together, strangers sharing space. Mrs. Whitmore sat alone near the door, awake like me, staring at nothing. Our eyes met across the packed room. She held my gaze for 3 heartbeats, then looked away. Dawn came slowly. Light seeped through the gaps around the door, turning the darkness gray before revealing the full extent of how many people were crammed into this space. 41 bodies that had survived the night. 41 people who would need food, water, warmth for however long it took the roads to clear. Nessa started making breakfast with what we had. Cornmeal mush cooked in the rendered fat. Not enough for everyone to feel full, but enough that no one would starve. People took their portions in cupped hands or shared bowls, ate in silence. The food was tasteless, but it was fuel. Mrs. Morrison approached me as I was cleaning Rosalie's cloths. The child was sleeping peacefully now, her mother having barely left her side all night. I owe you her life. Mrs. Morrison's voice was thick with emotion she was trying to control. I don't know how to repay that. You don't owe me anything. I wrung out the cloth.
My mother's knowledge saved her. Thank her. Your mother's gone, but what she learned isn't. That matters. That's worth something. She nodded, wiped her eyes. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled a small cloth bundle from her pocket and pressed it into my hands. This was my mother's. A cameo brooch. It's the only valuable thing I own. I want you to have it. I tried to hand it back. I can't take this. You can, and you will. Her voice firmed. Rosalie is my whole world. You gave me my world back. Let me give you something that matters to me. I looked at the brooch. The carved profile of a woman in ivory against a dark background. Beautiful. Old. Worth real money. Thank you. I closed my fingers around it. I'll keep it safe. Throughout the morning, others approached with offerings. Mr. Patterson brought tools from his hardware store stock that he'd managed to save. A good hammer, a saw with new teeth, a box of nails.
Constable Davis gave me an official letter stating that the county recognized our property and our right to manage it as we saw fit.
Another family brought seeds for vegetables. A woman, whose name I didn't know, left a jar of preserved jam. By noon, a small pile of gifts sat near our trunk. Payment for shelter we'd offered, without expecting anything in return. Around midday on the second day, Mrs. Whitmore stood. The movement caught my attention because she'd been so still for so long. She walked across the packed space toward where Nessa and I sat near the stove. The conversations around us gradually died. People watched. Mrs. Whitmore stopped 3 feet away, looked at me. Her face showed every one of her 50 years. The lines around her mouth, the shadows under her eyes, the weariness of someone carrying weight for too long. "I need to speak with you. Privately." I glanced at Nessa. She nodded slightly. I stood, and we walked to the far corner, as private as anything could be in a room holding 41 people. Mrs. Whitmore folded her hands at her waist. The gesture looked like armor. Or prayer. "I was wrong about you." The words came out stiff, rehearsed, like she'd been practicing them. "I wanted you to fail, because your father chose your mother over me 25 years ago. I held that anger. Let it make me cruel." She reached into her coat and withdrew a small wooden box, opened it. Inside was a gold locket on a delicate chain. "This belonged to my mother. It's the only thing of real value I own. I want you to have it." I looked at the locket, at the craftsmanship, at what it represented. "Why?" "Because you proved me wrong in every way that matters. You didn't fail. You didn't come crawling back. You built something real. You saved lives, mine included." She swallowed hard. "I spent 25 years being bitter. It made me ugly inside, made me hurt people who didn't deserve it. I can't undo that, but I can acknowledge it. I could have taken the locket, could have accepted it as payment or apology. Instead, I closed the box gently and pushed it back toward her. "Keep it." I met her eyes. "But I accept the apology. And I hope the bitterness leaves you." Her hands trembled as she took the box back. "Why won't you take it?" "Because I don't need it. What I needed was the truth. You gave me that." Something in her face crumpled, then rebuilt itself into something different, softer. She nodded once. "Thank you." She returned to her spot near the door. I watched her go and felt something release in my chest. Not forgiveness, exactly. Forgiveness would take time, but the beginning of it. The possibility. On the third day, men arrived from town with shovels and horses. They'd spent 2 days clearing the main road enough for wagons to pass. The families began preparing to leave. But before they departed, Constable Davis gathered everyone together. "I spoke with Mayor Harrison yesterday before we left. He asked me to make you all an offer." He looked directly at me and Nessa. "The town wants to build a proper refuge here. Bigger. Permanent. A place for emergencies like this storm. We'd like you two to manage it. The county would pay $30 a month. You'd live here, maintain it, keep supplies ready. When disaster comes, you open the doors. $30 a month. More money than Nessa and I had made in 3 months of work before buying this land. Steady income. Official recognition. A future that extended beyond mere survival." I looked at Nessa. She looked back at me. I could see the question in her eyes. This would mean staying, committing to this life. No going back to town. No easier path. But easier had never been our goal. Staying together was. "We accept." My voice carried across the crowded space. "We'll build something that lasts." The people left in groups over the next few hours. Families bundled together on wagons, individuals walking in the broken trail the horses had made. Each person thanked us before leaving, some with words, some with gestures, some with gifts pressed into our hands at the last moment. Mrs. Morrison hugged us both. Rosalie, wrapped in blankets and looking pale but alive, waved a small hand in goodbye. The Pattersons promised to bring the tools they'd mentioned. Constable Davis assured us the county would start work on expansion as soon as the ground thawed. By late afternoon, the hut was empty except for Nessa, Biscuit, and me. The space felt enormous. I could see the floor we'd built, the walls we'd raised,
the evidence of work that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. We stood in the center and turned slowly, taking it all in. The scorch marks on the floor near the stove, the way the light fell through the window, the silence that was ours again. Home. Nessa's voice was barely a whisper.
This is actually home. Yes. We didn't just survive, did we? We did something more. I thought about that, about what we'd accomplished. Not just building shelter, but becoming shelter. Not just saving ourselves, but creating a place that could save others. We became what people needed. I said it slowly, working out the truth as I spoke it. When everything fell apart, we were still standing.
That night we slept on the bunk, without 40 people pressed around us. The space felt too large, too quiet. Biscuit seemed confused by all the room. He kept getting up and wandering around, as if searching for the bodies that should have been there. But by morning, we'd adjusted, started planning. Nessa sketched ideas for a larger structure in the margins of one of the journals. I made lists of supplies we'd need. Seeds for planting, tools for building, fabric for making proper bedding. Spring came slowly. The snow melted in fits and starts, revealing the prairie beneath in patches of brown and gray. By April, we could walk to town without fighting through drifts. The county sent workers in May, 8 men who knew construction. They dug a proper foundation, extended the structure 20 feet to the east, added real windows with glass, built a separate sleeping room for Nessa and me, installed shelving for supplies. By June, the original hut was unrecognizable. It had become the heart of something larger. A refuge that could comfortably hold 60 people in emergency. A community gathering place. A symbol of what could be built when people refused to quit. We called it the Thorn Community Refuge. The name was the mayor's idea. Nessa and I agreed because it honored our parents, Thomas and Catherine Thorn, who gave us the tools to survive, even though they couldn't survive themselves. Throughout the summer, people stopped by, travelers heading west, families on their way to new homesteads. Sometimes they stayed for a meal, sometimes for the night. We never turned anyone away. Nessa's cooking became known throughout the county. She used our mother's recipes, adapting them to what we could grow in our garden. The vegetables Joseph Weaver had given us flourished. Turnips and carrots, and hardy greens that could withstand Nebraska's temperamental weather. I learned basic medicine from our mother's journal and from Dr. Morrison, who came out twice a month to teach me. Bandaging wounds, recognizing signs of serious illness, when to try treatment, and when to send someone to town for proper help. By autumn, we'd settled into a rhythm. Work, teaching, hosting. The refuge functioned exactly as the county had envisioned. A place of safety in the middle of unforgiving land. In September, Eleanor Pike came looking for her father's memory. She was perhaps 45 years old, with hair the color of wheat after harvest, and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much grief. She arrived on horseback, tied her mount outside, and knocked with hesitation. I answered. She studied my face as if trying to recognize something. "Are you Willa Thorne?" "I am." "My name is Eleanor Pike. This land belonged to my father, Ezra Pike. Please, come in." She stepped inside and looked around. The space had changed so much from what her father built, but some things remained. The curve of the original roof, the placement of the windows. "I haven't been here in 22 years. Her voice shook. "I left when I was 23. Got married, moved to Ohio. Told myself I'd come back to visit, but I never did. Then, 3 months ago, I got a letter from Joseph Weaver telling me my father had died. I retrieved Ezra's personal journal, the one Joseph Weaver had given me, opened it to the last entry.
This isn't mine to keep. I held it out to her.
It's yours.
Eleanor took the journal with trembling hands, read her father's final words about building this place, hoping she'd return. Tears spilled down her face without sound. When she finished, she closed the journal carefully and held it against her chest. He saved our lives. I told her the whole story. How we bought the land, found his journals, learned from his instructions, built the floor and walls following his diagrams. How his knowledge kept us alive through the worst winter in 20 years. You honored him. Eleanor's voice was thick. By surviving here, by learning from him, you gave his work meaning. She reached into her coat and pulled out a pocket watch. The metal was tarnished, but the mechanism still worked. I recognized it from the description in Ezra's personal journal, the watch his wife had given him before she died. He'd want you to have this. She held it out. You used his knowledge. You built on his foundation. That makes you family in the ways that matter. I took the watch, felt the weight of it, the history. A man's whole life could be measured in such small objects. Eleanor stayed for 3 days, walked the land her father had claimed, told us stories about him from when she was young, about his kindness, his stubbornness, his absolute certainty that hard work and careful planning could overcome almost any obstacle. On the morning she left, she hugged us both, whispered thank you, mounted her horse, and rode away toward a past she could never reclaim, but had finally made peace with. Nearly 1 year after our parents died, Nessa and I stood outside the refuge, watching the sun set over the prairie. October 1888, the same month we'd lost them. 9 months since we'd bought this land for $40. The anniversary hung between us, but didn't crush us anymore. Biscuit lay at our feet, gray showing in his muzzle now. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only comes in autumn. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd said yes to Mrs. Whitmore? Nessa's question drifted into the quiet. Sometimes. Would we be happier? I thought about that, about the alternative life we could have lived, separated, safe, warm, fed, living in other people's houses, following other people's rules, growing into different versions of ourselves. I don't think so. I shifted so I could see her face. Happiness isn't the same as easy. No? No. I reached for her hand, found it waiting. Our thumbs touched, the scars aligned. We chose each other. We chose hard work over comfort. We chose to build something instead of just surviving. That's not easy, but it's ours. Nessa turned her hand so our scars pressed together completely. The marks we got trying to split wood when we didn't know how. When we were younger and our parents were still alive, and the future seemed like something that would take care of itself. I'm glad we have the same scar. Her voice was soft. It reminds me we're not alone, even when we're apart. We carry the same marks. Inside the refuge, a lamp burned in the window. Smoke rose from the chimney. The walls we'd built stood solid. The floor we'd laid held firm. Everything we'd created through bleeding hands and exhausted bodies and refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. 5 families had already asked about building similar refuges in other parts of the county. The mayor wanted us to train others in what we knew, to spread this knowledge the way Ezra and our mother had spread it to us. We'd become teachers, keepers of knowledge bought with suffering and written down so others wouldn't have to learn the same lessons from scratch. The land provides for those who don't give up on it. I said the words our mother had written in her journal, words that had become true for us in ways she probably never imagined. Nessa squeezed my hand. We didn't give up, no. We built something worth keeping. The sun dropped lower,
The sky turned orange and pink and purple in bands that looked painted. Temperature began its nightly fall. Soon we'd need to go inside, feed the fire, prepare for another night in the refuge that used to be nothing but a metal shell and had become a home. But for now we sat together, two sisters, marked by the same scar, bound by choices made in desperation that had somehow transformed into purpose.
We were 18 and 17 years old.
We owned 10 acres of marginal land and a refuge that had saved 41 lives. We had a dog going grey around the muzzle and journals full of hard-won wisdom and a future that was ours to build. It wasn't the life our parents planned for us. It wasn't the life anyone in Cedar Falls expected us to create. But it was enough. More than enough. It was home.